Here we are in ancient Greece, and we're going to take a look at the emergence of, well, an unfortunate term, rational. All forms of medicine are rational, so long as they accord with their system, but we're looking at the emergence of so-called rational medicine in ancient Greece, and we're going to want to know how that took place. As our textbook points out, there's a number of different Greeks. For example, the Minoans, and they occupied the islands. We think that they came to the islands at the period where there still were land bridges connecting, for example, Turkey to various islands, and then eventually the Minoans, who occupied mainland Greece. They took over the Mycenaean culture, that disappeared, and then came in the Homeric Greeks. Interestingly, these individuals, they were nomadic. They came down from the north, and they were an illiterate society. They're an illiterate society, and they're the ones that develop rational medicine. According to Erwin Akkernet, a physician and anthropologist, he says 2,500 years ago, the Greeks took a radical step in human thought for which we have no explanation. Well, I'm going to tell you we do have an explanation, and we're going to take a look at why and how it emerged. So what was this radical step? Well, the radical step, it involved a shift. Sometimes we refer to this as a paradigm shift or a paradigm change from supernatural explanations to ones that rely upon natural theories of causation. And that can only take place because something new has taken place in ancient Greece. And this is democracy. So if we think back to earlier civilizations, they did not have a democratic society. They were what we refer to as a theocracy, where they had a god king. That king had defined themselves as a god. Greek peoples, they did have a king, but the king was not a god, existed independently of those gods. So ultimately, it's this political shift that allows for this radical step, this shift in supernatural explanations to natural ones. Protagoras says, for example, I have no means knowing whether the gods exist. Now, can you imagine trying to say that in Mesopotamia to Ur-Nammu? A good example of how a theocratic society would restrict the development of a naturalistic approach. Xenophanes, in an outright attack against the gods, says if oxen and horses and lions had hands and could draw as man does, horses would draw the gods shaped as horses, and oxen as oxen, each making the bodies of gods like their own. Where does this all take place? Well, Greece, but in an area that probably you're not familiar with or wouldn't expect. Miletus. Okay, so Miletus is right there in what we would define today as Turkey. So at one point of time, this was all Greek. And here we get a group of individuals referred to as the Milesian philosophers. And they begin to think about the world that they're in and the world around them in a fundamentally different way. And it all begins with the sea and an individual by the name of Tehelis. Like I said, Tehelis in the sea, and he reflects on that. And ultimately, what he says is the fundamental stuff of the universe, it's not the gods, it's water. And while the periodic table hasn't emerged, the Greeks are offering basic elements. And kind of the way this works is if you think about an apple, for example. Isn't an apple moist? Doesn't it have water inside of it? If we think of a tree, isn't it moist? And doesn't all life come from the seas? And again, pointing to the seas as a resource. And what happens when that tree dies? Doesn't it become dry? So this is one of the basic elements, water. Now in this era, now Tejeles, he's a businessman. Unfortunately, he had slaves and he has a lot of time to think. And well, maybe he meets an appropriate death for having slaves. He's walking around contemplating and he falls into a hole and dies. Yeah, I think that's appropriate. Either way, he has a student by the name of Anaximander. And in this type of society, people can challenge each other. And that's exactly what his student does. He says, no, water isn't the fundamental stuff. It's, hold on, air. Air is the fundamental stuff of the universe, says Anaximander. It's all around us. Ether, pneuma. And he has a student who challenges his idea. Parmenides kicks the ground and says, Earth. This is the fundamental stuff that gives life. Everything comes from the earth, perhaps pointing to plants and trees. And again, his ideas are challenged, and we finally get this idea offered by Heraclitus, who says, fire is the fundamental stuff of the universe, says Heraclitus. Now, this is quite ingenious. Let's take a look at something that's living. Go ahead, feel yourself. Feel your arm. Don't you feel heat? You're warm. And what happens when we're deceased or somebody is dead? Don't they lose heat? They're cold. This is something, again, that they're developing. And it makes a lot of sense at this point. And it's quite simplistic. There's no question about that. But in terms of the times, they're developing a basic understanding of physiology, and they're moving away from spirits and supernaturalism in an attempt to understand themselves. Now it starts to get sketchy. There's a lot of ideas emerging and a lot of problems that need to be solved. So Zeno here, he develops a series of paradoxes. Okay, Zeno's paradox. It's a classic and it has not been solved to this day. And ultimately what he says is finite things can be divided infinitely. So you're thinking, how's that possible? Well, let's take a look, say, at a ruler. Now this ruler, can we not divide it in half? Absolutely. On the right-hand side, can we not divide that half in half? Of course. The next half in half, and half, and half, and half. And you're saying, well, okay, eventually we get to a spot that's so small we can't divide it anymore. Well, if we used an electron microscope, we could, right? So there's always a half to divide, mathematically speaking. And sometimes I'll demonstrate this in class. He also said you can't walk from one side of the room to the next side of the room. So I'll walk, and I'll hit the side of the wall. And some students say, yeah, you know what? But in between your hand and that wall, even though there was a thump, there's still space. And you could divide it. And I say, absolutely. And Democritus did not like that idea. In fact, it made him clinically mad. He's often referred to as the laughing philosopher, because apparently this problem just drove him insane. He said the basic element, it's not earth, fire, air, or water. And you're thinking, oh, hey, wait, that's a Motown band. Yeah, it is. He says that there's a basic element, and you know what he says? You can't divide it. It's called an atom. And this is where our idea of the atom came from. When we discovered it, we called it the atom in the name of Democritus. And then we discovered, you know what, you can divide that. And when you divide it, it goes boom. So this has been a philosophical issue, and it really drives thinking at this point of time. And what it's showing us is how complex their thinking has become. Now, the Greek philosopher Plato, he had a solution. And I just want to, put him in a line of philosophical thinkers. His teacher was Socrates. And then we get Plato, and Plato, he taught Aristotle. And Aristotle taught, oh, you're going to have to wait until the next unit to find out. Anyhow, Plato had a solution for Zeno's paradox. He said there's two worlds. Number one, there's a world of pure forms. And this really ultimately resides in mathematics and pure philosophy. So here there's a perfect oak tree, for example. In contrast, if we look at the world around us, and I'm going to use that oak tree example, if there's a perfect oak tree, we see many oak trees. In the world of experience, this is a world of representations. And in a world of representations, we find errors. And we need to be cautious about those errors. In fact, Plato said we should not trust. So we shouldn't trust the world of representations. We should always be working towards understanding the pure forms. And really, that's only understood by what had been referred to as a psyche, later in history defined as the mind. As for the world of representations, this is the world of the body. It's lesser. It's not as important. Now, this is going to play a role in shaping what's going to take place in Alexandria. Alexandria, with Aristotle's student and a few other philosophers. I won't test you on the dates of Empedocles, but he was responsible for uniting, I almost said reuniting, the four humors: earth, fire, air, wind, and water. No, he was responsible for uniting the idea of the four elements with the four humors. So in the same way that philosophers imagine that there were these four basic elements: earth, fire, air, and water, they thought that there were also four humors in the body, parallels, in other words. So number one, there's, these sound gross, yeah, black bile. Number two, yellow bile, yuck. Phlegm. And of course, blood. So these are the four humors. And in the end, it produces this, I'm going to put quotation marks there, this rational model for understanding health and healing. I'll show you what this looks like on the next slide. So in the end, this is the model that Hippocrates very much draws upon, this humoral model. And it's eventually referred to as, and you've probably heard of allopathic versus homeopathic medicine, okay? We practice currently allopathic medicine, and it ultimately means that we cure with opposites. In contrast, homeopathic means like cures like. Okay, so cure with opposites. In other words, if you've got a cold, that type of thing, right? You want to have something warm, like chicken soup, which is hot. So ultimately, this is a symbolic model where individuals believe that something's happened in balance, or has caused us to move out of balance in our bodies. So for example, let's go to the center here. What color can I use? It's going to make sense. Well, let's go with green. Let's use a green. So this is where health is found. It is the center point between yellow bile, phlegm, blood, and black bile. And as we perhaps have too much of something, it takes us out of that balance. and moves us, for example, into an area where we have too much blood and you need to deal with that. Now, eventually, the way that people deal with an excess of blood is through, I'm going to write this up at the top, venesection, not vivisection. Vivisection we will be talking about shortly, but this is ultimately bloodletting. So barbers did this. You'd go and get your hair cut and you get your beard shaved and they'd slit you somewhere on your wrists or on your neck and you'd bleed a little bit. And the idea was that it would put you back into balance. Now, they weren't doing that during the times of Hippocrates, but it is a model that emerged at that point of time in history. So, another example of allopathic medicine, and this is common in a lot of folk medicine. My grandmother, for example, if I had a cold, right, shivers, shakes, she'd suggest having Shlivovica, white lightning from the mountains, plum brandy. You don't want to give that to a 6-year-old kid, I'll tell you that much. In contrast, homeopathic medicine, and this is beginning to emerge as something that we refer to as alternative medicine. Homeopathic, like cures like. So the idea is if you're hot, if you're running a fever, what you do is you encourage that fever with more warmth. Cause the fever to rise, and there appears to be some logic behind that as well. You're addressing the environment in your body, you're augmenting it, so you potentially kill off viruses. Yeah. Either way, a couple of different models. We use the allopathic one today in modern medicine, and this is derived back to Empedocles and made really popular by Hippocrates. The very first medical author, Greek medical author, is an individual by the name of Alcimon of Croton, and he argues that the brain is the seat of life. Now, this is a big shift. In ancient Egypt, they thought that it was the heart, and a lot of Greeks continue to believe that it was the heart as well. But either way, he got at this, and he starts to talk about something that we refer to as psyche. This is the root for psychology or psychic, and it means the seat of life. It's the mind, the soul, kind of the same word at this point of time, or nous, as the Greeks said. And one of the ways that he got to this is, and we're not sure how he did it because he wasn't allowed to engage in dissections, but he recognized that there's this nerve that he referred to as the optic nerve, and that was connected to the brain. And he thought, based upon that the brain must be processing this stuff in some manner. The Greeks are interesting, at least for me, because you've heard of that saying, that phrase, you can't have your cake and eat it too? Well, wrong. The Greeks did it. They had their cake and they ate it as well. What do I mean by this? Well, they had developed this idea of naturalistic medicine. And in that model of naturalistic medicine, they said the gods play no role in health and healing. Okay, so that's that big shift. On the other hand, they said, of course the gods exist. And they included them, for example, Hippocrates, who was a entirely naturalistic. In the Hippocratic Oath, he says, I swear by Apollo, Asclepius, and all the gods and goddesses of health and healing, to be a good physician. And we still swear by that today. So there's an obvious contradiction. Like I said, they're going to have their cake and they're going to eat it as well. And for them, that's absolutely fine. And it works. So we can say that while the Greeks emphasized natural causation, disease causation, right? For example, that homeopathic model and balance, too much of something is going to cause illness. Or even, and they were the first individuals to look at geographic situations and diseases associated with particular environments or geography. But they're going to say, even though we have these natural causes and they sought those naturalistic explanations, they continued to believe in their myths. And their myths ultimately, did figure into their worldview. They just diminished the importance of those gods when it came to health and healing. And as pointed out, the way that they were able to kind of remove or omit the role of gods was through that democratic system where their society wasn't based upon a theocracy. So on the other side, we had the other slide. We saw that they were having their cake, and now here they're going to eat it. So in fact, all medicine in Greek, it's thought to be connected in one way or another to the gods. And like I said, curious, but for them, it works just fine. So let's take a look at some of these connections, because the connections that we see here in ancient Greece, they're going to continue through world history in the West and in Europe, and especially as we move into Rome and then Christianity. There are a number of gods in the Greek pantheon. A pantheon is I'll write that up top. A pantheon, it's a collection of gods. And not only do we find this in Greece, but we're going to find it in pagan Rome as well, and we're going to have a shift once we have the rise of Christianity. So Apollo, he's one of the main gods. We've got Zeus, Apollo, Hades, and whatnot. And Apollo, he's the Greek god of health and healing. That's his domain. Now, Apollo, as pointed out, he's a god. And he's got a son, Asclepios. And he's a demigod. And what we're going to find with this individual Asclepios, he's adopted by the Romans after the Romans conquer the Greeks, except they think the Greek way of spelling it and saying it, it's just too harsh. So they call him Asclepios in Rome. Here we see an image of Apollo. And in Homer, in his Odyssey, he describes an outbreak of disease. And it's ultimately traced to Apollo. He says that Apollo, from his quiver, he takes out his arrows and he shoots them down to earth. And with those arrows, not errors. No, we're going to correct that. With those arrows, he brings pestilence. So that's how people explain disease in the early days. And I think what's interesting is we start to get this shift from a type of polytheistic religion, where we have a pantheon of gods, to a monotheistic religion. But these gods never disappear. And what I'm going to point out here, and I just want to draw your attention to the symbolism in this, the important symbolic associations that we find with Apollo. He obviously has those arrows. Okay, and he's often around a tree. For whatever connection that I'm not sure, but that's the connection. This tree, the arrows, we have a bow and arrow, and it's associated with disease. Later on in Christian history, we're going to see a very similar figure who has the same type of symbolism. His name is Saint Sebastian. So the idea, according to scholars in this area, they said that really what happened wasn't that they got rid of all of the old pagan gods, because that would pose a transition problem for people adopting Christianity, especially if they were pagans. History from the last 1,000 years, it involved adopting gods of other people and perhaps renaming them. So people argue that that's what happened in Christianity. They didn't entirely get rid of Apollo or Asclepius. They just gave them a new name. They gave them a Christian name and associated it with a Christian figure. We also see this. This takes place with voodoo. And some people might be thinking voodoo, not the Hollywood version. Voodoo or Voodoo is an ancient African religion, but when it was brought to Haitian communities with their migration and the slavery that occurred there, they needed to hide their gods, and they did so through saints. So if you look at voodoo as it's practiced in Haitian communities, you think that they're praying to St. Paul, for example. In part, they're also praying to the parallel figure in voodoo. Let's move to the next slide and talk a little bit about Asclepius. Fascinating figure. Here we see a statue of Asclepius. We know it's him because of this symbol that always is alongside of him, this staff with a snake wrapped around it. So let's take that staff. I'm going to draw it out here. And we're going to put a couple of little snakes around it, winding around. Is this starting to look like something? Maybe not. My drawing might be not good enough. Okay, a couple of snakes there. Have you seen that before? It's often associated with medical clinics, your doctor's office. It's also the official sign of the World Health Organization. Interesting that they make this connection to Asclepius. He was just that important of a figure and represented a change that was taking place, moving towards a naturalistic approach, because eventually we get a group of healers that refer to themselves as the Asclepiads, and that's the school of thought that Hippocrates comes from. But like I said, they're going to have their cake and they're going to eat it too. Asclepius, he's the son of Apollo, a god, and also a mortal woman, which makes him a demigod. Now, he's taught medicine by Chiron, and Asclepius has a couple of pretty important events in his life. Apparently, he cures a blind person. These are the testaments of Asclepius. So he cures the blind. He cures an individual with paralysis. And he cures a person of death. He raises them from the dead. Does that sound familiar? Son of a god, a mortal woman, cures the blind, the so-called lame or paralysis, better term, we don't want to use lame, it's not a nice word, and 5, raises a person from the dead. This story predates Jesus of Nazareth by probably at least 1,000 years. Anyhow, Zeus and Hades, they're furious with what Asclepius has done. Hades in particular, he says that Asclepius has taken a soul from me. And Zeus agrees. He had no business raising somebody from the dead. That's not the work of a demigod. And Zeus strikes Asclepius down dead. Asclepius' father said, no, I'm not going to have this. You're not going to kill my son. Apollo raises Asclepius. Well, I've spelled that wrong. Let's not spell that wrong. He raises Asclepius. I haven't spelled it entirely wrong. This is why it's so important to go back and take a look at your material. Asclepius. He raises Asclepius from the dead. Resurrects him. And he comes to the heavens with Apollo. Like I said, a very similar story. And as we're going to see, this poses great problems to the rise of Christianity. Because, when pagans hear about Jesus of Nazareth and his miracles, for example, or those connections, Apollo, who's a god, a mortal woman, cured the blind, paralysis, raised the dead. Oh, and then he was raised from the dead. They say, well, we've already got one of those. We don't need it. His name is Asclepius. And in fact, the early bishops of Christianity, they engage in arguments to illustrate that Jesus of Nazareth is in fact the real God Savior, not Asclepius. They say he's more like a magician. They actually recognize the existence and acts, the so-called miracles of Asclepius. Very interesting history that we're usually not privy to, for example, at Sunday school. As for Hippocrates, and I'm not going to test you on when he lived either, just Hippocrates, he's a descendant of Asclepius on one side of his family. On the other side of his family, he's a descendant of Hercules. Either way, pretty important dude. He relies upon observations rather than myth and dogma. He's not going to trust what people have said. He said, I'm going to learn for myself. And some of the important topics that Hippocrates does discuss. He's interested in ethics. He's interested in bedside manner. And also appropriate fees, very similar to the Code of Hammurabi, right? Hippocrates, he practices, obviously, that humoral medicine, okay? And for him, health is about balance, diet, and natural causes. A good example, and I'll also point out that he doesn't believe in surgery. So he thinks that most things can be dealt with through diet, correcting our health through diet. And I think in a number of respects, he's probably right there. As for natural causes, a good example of the shift in thinking. Historically, okay, so historically we had pointed out that epilepsy and disease in general, it was connected to supernaturalism. Hippocrates says epilepsy is not the sacred disease. It doesn't have anything to do with possession. In contrast, he thinks it has to do with phlegm, an excess of phlegm. Now he's wrong. Okay, an excess of phlegm is not going to cause epilepsy. But either way, he's trying to move to a naturalistic explanation. I'll give you another example. Hysteria. Okay, hysteria was also discussed by Hippocrates, and he thought it was a woman's disease. And he said that this also was related to balance. Oh, let me give an example. I'm going to try to be cautious here. An exchange of fluids between man and woman, male and female. Okay, he thought that was necessary in life. And when females didn't get enough semen, that affected their uterus. And their uterus started to dry up and placed pressure on the abdomen and led to hysteria. Okay, he's wrong. He's absolutely wrong. But the interesting thing about this kind of idea, it didn't change until the 1800s. And actually, 1800s, it was widely practiced. Even once we get into the early 1900s, people are still using this model. I'll give you an example. Dr. Bliss, a prominent physician in the United States of America. I'm going to erase that so you can see this properly. Dr. Bliss, who was a prominent physician in the United States of America, argued that when women, and I'm going to go up top to give myself a little more space, he said that there's a surgical procedure for women who don't act feminine. And that he meant by doing housework. In addition to housework, they might have an overactive sexual libido, which wasn't appropriate. They might talk back to their husbands, stuff like that. And he said the solution for that type of illness or sickness, and that's what he thought it was, a sickness, was to remove the ovaries and the uterus, to engage in an ovariodectomy. I'm going to go down to our dates over here. By 1906, 100, I'm going to write it right underneath, 120,000 women in the United States forcibly underwent ovariodectomies because they didn't act as society had defined them. They didn't act according to the established femininity. They were apparently deviant. They didn't want to do housework that women did. They wanted to have sex. They spoke back to their husbands. So this ultimately leads to a problem in medicine as well, where people try to control people's behavior through the institution of medicine. Last slide here. The Plague of Athens. The Plague of Athens, it really is seen, at least by me. I focused on it in 2002 in my graduate work. And it kind of, I don't know, I had that aha moment when I was reading Thucydides. And one of the things that Thucydides noted about the Plague of Athens, he said that there was massive social upheaval. Some of the examples he gives, and he says, people started to realize it didn't make a difference if they were pious or impious. In other words, good or bad. It didn't make a difference if they stole from people, if they prayed to the gods or they didn't pray to the gods. You died. It was that simple. And with that, people lost faith in the system. And he said they paid no attention to such things anymore. So what impact did the plague have upon medical culture? Well, it created a rift. It created that moment when people were able to reflect and say, and as Thucydides said, people didn't pay attention to the gods in health and healing anymore. They stopped praying to them because they soon learned if you prayed, you were going to die anyhow. And then along came Hippocrates and said, the gods play no role in health and healing. And they said, oh, that makes sense. So what disease was the Plague of Athens? For those of you that have made it this far, this will be on the test. So here's a bonus. Typhoid fever, it's caused by a salmonella infection. We figured that that's what it is. And this is a result of studies on people's teeth from the plague pits. They've looked at them and they've been able to identify the DNA for that causes typhoid fever. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Our next unit we're going to pick up with ancient Alexandria. Take care.